There's been a lot of panic recently, especially in the conservative commentariat, over the increasing desire expressed by young white Americans to receive representation as a collective political bloc. At some level, this is understandable. Race isn't the healthiest fixation when it comes to understanding identity, but the approach conservative critics have taken is extremely misguided. For decades, whites have watched every other group in America successfully demand political action as a bloc from both the left and the right. Democrats build their entire party around racial grievance, but even conservatives are quick to speak to the needs of minority communities as a collective group. Despite attacking the concept of identity politics, Republicans are more than happy to cater to them for any group except their core constituency, white Americans. If conservatives are truly worried about the rise in white identitarianism, they need to stop lecturing young white Americans and start addressing the behaviors of the communities they currently pander to. First, it's probably worth defining our terms. Race and ethnicity are often used interchangeably in modern discussion, but they're not the same. Race is a macro category, while ethnicity is more of a particular micro category. Peoples as diverse as the Swedes, Italians, Irish, and French, they're all considered white. And Ethiopians, Nigerians, African pygmies, and Somalians, they're all considered black. Now, these categories like white and black, they certainly mean something. I'm not saying race doesn't exist, but ethnos tends to be a more organic and useful way to understand these groups when you can access it. Now, ironically, ethnocentrism is a characteristic that varies wildly between races and is particularly low among white Europeans and their descendants. If you were to take a United States primarily comprised of residents of European extraction and add some immigrants, you're likely going to have a pretty tolerant and accepting society. Even the new arrivals who might be predisposed to ethnocentrism are less likely to maintain it because there's simply not enough of their co-ethnics around to take advantage of the tribal strategy. This means that assimilation is far more likely to occur. It's also important to remember that identity is not a binary, but a series of nested interests which can be more or less salient depending on scale. When societies are small, aspects like tribe and ethnos are often primary. But as civilization grows and needs to include new members, the focus of identity shifts to larger macro characteristics that can encompass more people, like religion. White Americans used to have very defined ethnic conclaves with almost exclusively Irish, Italian, Dutch, and German neighborhoods and towns across the United States. In some places, the American government had to work very hard to break the exclusive nature of German communities, all but forcing them to send their children to schools where they would have to learn English. Today, while the echoes of European ethnos still exist in the traditions of many American communities, these groups now fully conceive of themselves as Americans. The problem comes when the government imports large blocks of people into the country who share the same ethnicity and have not gone through this process of scaling up their identity. These new arrivals have zero problems with ethnocentrism because they can and will leverage that strategy for all its advantages. They see no reason to adopt a different political understanding because their co-ethnics are there to ensure that they'll be elevated by nepotism and never need to assimilate. Employment, education, marriage, and community can all be had almost exclusively inside their ethnic conclave. In a system where one group has to rely on pure individual meritocracy, while the others are allowed to operate on collective ethnocentrism, tribalism wins. Once it reveals itself as the superior strategy, the salience of race skyrockets. When young whites see everyone else deploying tribalism and winning, they start to ask the obvious question: why are we the only group that's denied the winning strategy? Now, of course, it's not just that tribalism seems to work for all the other groups, but it's also that the system has been explicitly rigged against white males. Jacob Savage's article, The Lost Generation in Compact Magazine, recently made waves by laying out the obscene degree to which universities, media outlets, and corporations have intentionally shut white men out of major institutions. He laid out all of the narrative, but he also laid out the statistics, and they were absolutely staggering. That piece got more attention because it came from a leftist, but conservatives like Jeremy Carl and Heather McDonald have been warning about the problems for years. Whites, especially young white men, aren't allowed to advocate as a group like everyone else gets to, but they are allowed to be punished as a group. Telling them that identity politics is bad and then sitting by and watching while whites are punished explicitly for their identity is a strategy that will kind of arrive at predictable results. They're gonna be resentful. They're gonna see the hypocrisy. The response from the conservative movement has been a vague general rebuke of ethnocentrism, but to only really reject it for whites. They'll pay lip service to opposing identity politics, but they'll pander directly to explicitly racial organizations. Conservatives will say nothing about blacks, Indians, Hispanics, or Jews having prominent racial solidarity organizations. In fact, conservatives will take the leaders of those organizations very seriously, speak to their concerns, and treat them as if they are representatives of their community. Donald Trump recently hosted the American Hindu-Jewish Congress. No, I promise, I am not making that name up, at Mar-a-Lago to discuss combating bigotry for both groups. You're not going to see a dinner honoring representatives from the White American Congress to discuss anti-white bigotry, even though we have direct evidence that it's far more widespread of a problem in modern America. That double standard is just too obvious for young white people to keep ignoring forever, especially when they're being treated the way they're being treated. If conservatives were serious about stopping the rise of collective white identity politics, they would stop lecturing young white people for noticing the obvious. They would instead attack the systemic bias against whites in corporations and academia. To their credit, the Trump administration has started to take action on this issue, though far more needs to be done. This is just the tip of the iceberg. If they were serious, conservatives would initiate an immigration moratorium and would aggressively prosecute ethnic cartels in the United States. Sorry, but every store or tech department with an Indian manager isn't filling open positions with their co-ethnics because there's just no white people who can work on computers in America. Conservative leaders should be lecturing blacks, Indians, Hispanics, and Jews just as aggressively as they lecture whites about ethnocentrism. If for no other reason than whites, actually vote for the GOP, while all these other groups, outside of Hispanic males in the last election, vote overwhelmingly Democrat. If you are really worried about the rising desire for collective white politics, try reducing the number of ethnocentric populations young white people are expected to compete with on pure merit. The only way to reduce the salience of race is to stop importing ethnocentric cultures and creating political carve-outs for the minority communities that are already here. In short, show young white people that they can succeed without ethnocentrism by actually addressing and punishing ethnocentrism that is currently practiced by every other group here in the United States. Gather your courage and talk to the minorities who are already practicing the very behavior you claim to fear. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click like, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do so. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, make sure to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform, and when you do, leave a rating or review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. New year, guys, let's push the podcast to the top of the charts. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter or Gab or Substack or Instagram, if you want to watch these videos on Rumble or Odyssey, the links to do all of that are down below in the description. And of course, if you'd like to watch any of my shows or read any of my columns, you can check them out over at The Blaze. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.